China is reporting a spike in its case numbers in a northern city today. 49 new cases confirmed in Tianjin. It has 14 million people in that city. They're all being tested now, and there are restrictions in place in many other parts of the country as China scrambles to get a lid on Omicron cases, because China, of course, is preparing to host the World. The Winter Olympic Games begin on February 4th with the opening ceremony. Canadian athletes are being named to the team. They are getting set to head to Beijing. And boy, is there ever a lot of focus on keeping them safe ahead of that February 4th date. Dr. Michael Wilkinson is with us to tell us more about that. He's the Chief Medical Officer for the Canadian Olympic Committee, and he's a member of the COC COVID-19 Task Force. Task Force is really our topic for today, but let's say good morning again to Dr. Wilkinson. Welcome back.
Morning, Heather.
I was thinking back just to a few months ago. We had this conversation ahead of the Tokyo Olympics about COVID. And here we are ahead of another Olympic Games, still talking about the threat of COVID, but for Beijing this time. What's different this time, Dr. Wilkinson?
Thanks, Heather. I think there's a number of things that are different this time. First off, there's a lot of learnings that we put in place from Tokyo, both on our side as well as the IOC side. There's also far greater availability of vaccines and boosters. And obviously, the big talking point at the moment is the number of cases and the prevalence of Omicron in Canada and worldwide, which is really making us emphasize those preventive measures that we did have before Tokyo, but really knuckling down to make sure that we do everything we can to actually get to Beijing negative and safe.
That's an interesting part of this discussion. I mean, the concern seems to be really on making sure that the athletes can get and the rest of the team can get to Beijing. Forget about almost what's going to happen there. Because I was reading, Dr. Wilkinson, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that anyone who tests positive for COVID within the 2-week window prior to their departure for Beijing will not be allowed into the country. Is that the ruling as you understand it?
That's part of what we've been working with IOC and Beijing about, because that was the definitive hardline ruling previously. But in discussions with IOC and looking with infectious disease and their medical expert panel, we at least now have the ability to have positive cases or people that test positive reviewed. I think the issue is if you get COVID close to your departure time, that's when it becomes an issue. But we all know that there are cases of persistent shedders, so to speak, and Beijing requires 2 negative PCR tests, one at 96 hours, one at 72 hours before departure. So we've actually been doing some pre-screening to try and identify the positive shedders. We've also been submitting requests for exemption in people that have tested positive and are persistent shedders. And so there's a lot of, how would we say, logistical legwork that goes into this. But there is some hope to get people in there. However, obviously, it's far easier to get there when you are not positive.
So you figured out, have a little bit of negotiation or have determined what exactly you're going to be allowed to do. And to illustrate the seriousness with which you are addressing this, as I understand it, there's a weekly meeting of some of the top sports figures and sports managers, one of whom is yourself, but Ann Merklinger from On the Podium. And can you just tell us, you meet weekly to talk about these very issues, making sure the team gets there. Tell me a little bit about your weekly sessions, who's taking part, and the kinds of things that you're trying to address right now at this point.
So that's a task force that was put together long before Tokyo, very early on in the pandemic, actually. And the focus at that time was to enable athletes to train safely. How do we get resources to them? What support do they need? How do we prepare them for Tokyo? It's very similar at the moment, and it's made up of leaders across sports, so including On the Podium, the COC, CPC, high performance managers, CEOs from various sports, and obviously at the moment a lot of winter sports. We also have representatives from Sport Canada, CCS, Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and some of the summer sports as well, in order to help us sort of gather those learnings from Tokyo and some of the winter sports that are still qualifying, that are over in Europe, the experiences that they are having, how we manage that as well. So the agenda varies from week to week, but the focus is purely on how do we provide the support and the safety net for our athletes and teams to get to Beijing safely.
Based on what you're learning from all of those voices and all of that input, what is your best guidance as they look to you, the athletes? What are you telling them to do at this point?
Well, right now, I sound a little bit like a stuck record because, to be honest, right now we are, for some team members, they are 15 days away from departing on one of the charters. And it really is the critical time of getting into a semi-bubble. Some of the teams have been in bubbles, I'll use the term bubble lightly, but in training groups for the last few weeks and are doing daily rapid antigen tests. They're doing regular PCR tests. They really are doing absolutely everything they can to minimize the chance of infection, given how infectious and how prevalent Omicron is. And let's not forget that there's still Delta out there as well. So even those that have had perhaps Omicron earlier in December or over the holidays does not mean that they are exempt from any of these measures. So everything that we can do to minimize the chance of infection, cutting down on socialization, not going to restaurants, all those sorts of things that we've been talking about for years. We're also doing added testing, so a screen at 16 days out, just to try and identify those people who may have an inadvertent positive that are asymptomatic. So we can actually work with Beijing and the IOC to make sure we get the CT values in time and the medical information to apply for an exemption or to get them in.
So all of these things going on, people should maybe know, because we're going to find out who's on the Canadian women's hockey team today, for example. 4 p.m. we're going to get that announcement. But that's maybe a good example. They have really decided they're not going to play any more games before the Olympics, and they're trying to enter as much of a bubble as they can to try to ensure that they can get on that plane to go. I wonder, is a bit of a balance, Dr. Wilkinson, in that these last competitions or last training sessions, if those are canceled, it might affect an athlete's preparation. But is it worth it? I mean, is it a bit of a trade-off at this point?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's very much a trade-off and looking at the risk-benefit ratios. You know, there's some athletes that are still trying to qualify overseas. And for them, that competition is essential to get to Beijing, to qualify for Beijing. So through the Sports Med Advisory Commission, we've basically been saying if it's not an essential tournament, if you need to travel, then you need to seriously rethink about doing that. But obviously there is the focus on final preparation and, you know, honing their skills. And some athletes need to prepare that way. Other athletes, for instance, in the women's hockey team, they're able to get into their bubble. So they've got together a few days ago. They've gone into isolation first. They've been testing, and they'll be doing their training and their practices together. So avoiding games, which is not the way they're used to preparing. But we did see in Tokyo that a lot of the sports and a lot of the teams that actually had not gone to multiple competitions and hadn't had any races for some of them 19 months before the games did extremely well. The women's 8 rowing team, a case in point, they had not had a race since 2019 and won.
Dr. Wilkinson, you know, there's a lot to talk about, and we're not even talking about COVID in Beijing and keeping the athletes safe and healthy once they are there at the Olympic competition. We'll save that conversation for another day, but I very much appreciate your telling us about this critical time before Team Canada gets on the planes for Beijing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. Nice to talk to you again.
Nice to speak with you again.